Hi, welcome to the Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring AIM Data Use webinar series. In the course of this series, we will have people sharing examples of how they are using AIM at the various scales, including the project level, the field office level, the state office level, and even at the national reporting level.
So today we're really excited to present the multi-program AIM applications in the Uncompahgre field office in Colorado. Today our presenters will be Jedd Sondergard, who's a hydrologist there in Uncompahgre, and Ken Holsinger, who's the botanist. I'll pass it over to them shortly. In terms of us on the AIM team, we have Alita Nafis, who introduced us. She's the terrestrial AIM lead in the detail right now at the NOC. We also have Lauren Price here, who's the AIM implementation lead, and myself, Alex Trainer, who's the terrestrial analyst. So feel free to reach out to us. We have our email addresses there if you have any questions, comments. But with that, I'd like to pass it over to Ken and Jedd. So take it away, Ken and Jedd.
All right, thanks guys. Hopefully you can see our presentation here. Just a quick note, we'll start with some pretty pictures before we dive into the nitty-gritty with graphs and data. So enjoy the initial photography. So we're gonna just talk about 3 examples of using upland and aquatic AIM data at the field office scale in the Uncompahgre field office. Next slide. So example number 1 is a fire that we experienced in July of 2018. The fire burned 36,000 acres. It originated on BLM and burned up through the forest. The fire actually lasted, well, it didn't go out until the snow came in November, December. Next slide. So one of the questions, one of the monitoring questions that we wanted to answer was, how has the stream channel changed post-fire? You can see in the picture we've got a pretty extensive portion of the watershed that was burned, a lot of steep slopes, a lot of rock present in the watershed. Next slide. So often after fires, flood events seem to follow. So this is a flood event that happened in August of 2018. You can see all the black ash that was deposited that originated up on the fire. We were fortunate that on BLM only a portion of the watershed of the entire watershed burned. So there was the lower portion of the watershed that still had intact riparian vegetation, but you can still see the effects, all this deposition that occurred on the stream banks. Next slide. So this is just a depiction of the fire perimeter in red there, and you can see how it lays in relationship to the BLM and the Forest Service. The blue dots are the AIM points that we were fortunate to have. We've been implementing AIM in our field office since 2016. So we had a number of points that were on stream systems downstream of the fire, and 1 point on Big Atkinson Creek that was actually in the fire. The Big Atkinson watershed burned 49% of the watershed, or 10,000 acres or so, was actually burned. Next slide. So just a picture from 2016 when the original site was monitored. On the left, on the right, you can see a little bit different angle, but you can see after the fire went through the changes and the regeneration that's already begun. Next slide. Okay, so one of the indicators that we were able to use from the AIM data to look at pre-fire versus post-fire is the pebble count. The AIM protocol uses the Woolman pebble count. It's actually a really robust protocol that's used. There's over 200 samples that are collected on 13 transects. And so just looking at the histogram of the particles, you can see pre-fire, we had a pretty good distribution of all of the particles, maybe trending more to the lower end, but had gravels all the way up to larger diameter particles. Post-fire, which is the gray bars, there was a reduction in some of those mid-sized gravels, trending more towards the fines or the larger particles. Next slide. This is just another depiction of that. You can see the trend post-fire towards the larger diameter particles. My presumption in looking at this data is that with the storm events that passed through the watershed, the bed load was scoured because we had increased flows from all of the uplands contributing that had been burned off. They scoured a lot of the finer particles, exposing larger diameter particles in the bed. So basically a lot of bigger rock, and you can actually see this when you're out present on the site. There's a lot more rock visible in the stream bed. And then as the storm flow is receding, some of those fine particles start to drop out on the fringes of the stream channel, and so then you're starting to pick a lot of that up as real fine diameter particles. And those are contributions that certainly are being contributed from the hill slopes and from the uplands that result in those fine particles being deposited and washing off the hill slopes. Next slide.
Okay, so because of the size of this fire, a lot of our landscape is prone to cheatgrass and other invasive annual weed conversion. We worked with the State Game and Fish Agency and put a bear team together and collaborated on a restoration plan and pursued emergency stabilization and monies through the BLM to reseed a lot of the really productive ecological sites within the burn area. And per the ESNR protocol, we're asked to follow AIM protocols for monitoring and reporting outcomes from ESNR related projects. So what we show here is just, again, following the protocols that set forth by AIM. We put a study design together. The table down below kind of shows what, if you've prepared a monitoring design worksheet, that's the table that you generally have to put together in a monitoring design worksheet. We put it together for this. We have our minimum, we have our sample size, our approximate weight, and then I used our AIM crew. They finished a little early from their regular field office monitoring design project, and we switched gears and were able to get this monitoring done. So we got 13 AIM points put in last year after we seeded the fire the previous winter. And so we were able to start to look at success, whether or not we were meeting objectives for the fire. And so the top left figure shows bare ground. We said that we wanted to achieve 30% or less bare ground within 3 years post seeding. So you can see there that with 80% confidence, we are getting close, but as you'd expect with 1 year post fire, not really getting there just yet, and I expect that to continue to improve over time. One of our other monitoring objectives was a minimum of 10% native perennial cover on the burn area, particularly where we seeded within the first growing season. And so you can see with 80% confidence that our standard seed mix strata, as well as our wildlife seed mix strata areas we seeded, indeed met that objective, but so too did the unseeded areas. The reality is we were very fortunate and had one of the more phenomenal springs we've had in the last 2 decades last year to get that seeding started. Another example of how we're using AIM data in the field office is our land health assessments. So we follow the AIM protocol for a given allotment or landscape unit we're going to do land health on, and we stratify the unit and randomly select our sample locations with the shiny tool. Using the weighted analysis principles, we tend to focus on ecological sites and or treatments where the majority of AUMs are likely to be derived. Then we go out and perform the IRH protocol, and in that process we also collect supplemental data, but we generally follow the AIM protocol. So we are collecting very similar data that we can compare with existing AIM data. And then we do the evaluation, rate departure from reference, and look at trend. And unfortunately in this field office, trend is extremely problematic for us. Most of our trend data is photo frames, and then about 20 years ago, they switched to Daubenmeier frame monitoring with no follow-up. So trend is incredibly difficult, which is why what we do with the AIM data, which is then we look and we compare our supplemental IRH data with AIM data from other BLM lands in the appropriate MLRA. So what we do there is we select AIM and LMF points in the appropriate MLRA. And the reason we do that is common soils, common climate, common vegetation types, and most importantly, it's following the NRCS ecological site process for naming and describing ecological sites. We then attribute the points data from our IRH and the AIM data with Landfire BPS. That gives us the ability to compare similar sites, to our IRH sites. We then select those common BPS from the MLRA and analyze the data for core indicators as appropriate. So the figure below shows bare ground comparison in sagebrush ecological sites and pinyon juniper woodland sites in comparison of our mailbox park allotment in this instance and the MLRA 36 where the allotment occurs. And we can see that bare ground is very comparable in both of those ecological sites. And then we use the appropriate statistical test. In this case, we just used a t-test to show that indeed there is no statistical difference. We do this for soil stability. So again, in sagebrush sites and pinyon juniper sites, we can see that the MBP, which is mailbox park, actually appears to have slightly better soil stability values than similar ecological sites within MLRA 36 for both sagebrush and pinyon juniper ecological sites. Also for foliar cover, you can see for this instance that we have significantly greater foliar cover in our sagebrush ecological sites than do other BLM sites in the MLRA, whereas pinyon juniper woodlands have very comparable total foliar cover. And a big reason why that foliar cover is so different in sagebrush sites is because we have a significantly greater amount of invasive species in this particular allotment on sagebrush ecological sites than other sagebrush sites in the MLRA. Also, over there in the figure on the right, invasive species are also substantially worse in pinyon juniper woodland ecological sites than they are in other places in the MLRA. Conversely, another common issue we saw in this particular land health evaluation area was that perennial grasses were consistently lower than ecological site potential or even absent. And so we looked at perennial grass both in sagebrush ecological sites and perennial in PJ woodlands. Oddly, we found that there was no real difference in perennial grass cover in sagebrush sites from our area compared to the MLRA. And we did see significantly less perennial grass in pinyon juniper woodlands than other PJ sites in the MLRA. So it's another line of evidence to help us kind of affirm what we're seeing with the IRH process. So our IRH process showed that there was none to slight departure for bare ground and soil stability. And this data process, or this data analysis process, just sort of reaffirmed that the allotment is also very comparable to other indicators, very comparable to other BLM lands within the MLRA 36. Whereas for biotic integrity, we showed moderate to extreme departures from reference for invasive species in both treated sites and sagebrush sites, and perennial grass is largely absent from several sites within sagebrush ecological sites in this particular allotment. So the analysis, simply put, suggests that invasive species, in this case cheatgrass and alyssum, are a real issue and conditions are substantially worse than on this particular unit than they are on other BLM lands. It's really bad. Perennial grass, the perennial grass structural functional group was commonly less than site potential in the allotment, and the data analysis suggests that this is the case for PJ woodlands as well. With no statistical difference in grass cover for the sagebrush ecological sites, the question is, does BLM in MLRA 36 have a common issue? And because we use the AIM principles, we're able to make inference, and so each individual IRH point that we evaluate, we assign a meeting for the particular land health standard. So in this case, we're looking at standard 3 for healthy plant and animal communities. And based on the weighted analysis, we can infer that roughly 1,407 acres, plus or minus, do not meet standard 3 for healthy plant and animal communities. So our third example is the vegetation treatment environmental assessment. Last year, our field office embarked on doing a programmatic vegetation treatment environmental assessment. And anybody who's done programmatic environmental assessments, there's a whole lot of hand-wringing and not a lot of conclusions made. So we were able to take our AIM data and really put some meaningful analysis to these programmatic approach. So just a little background, our field office had 158,964 acres treated in the field office since 1950. That equates to 29% of the surface area we manage. 33,500 acres of that was chaining and was subsequently seeded with crested wheatgrass, yellow sweet clover, and dryland alfalfa. And many of these sites were rocky sites with very thin soils that have experienced substantial soil loss and alteration post-treatment. Also, many of these sites have experienced 2 to 4 major disturbances in the last 50 years. So they chained them, trees came back, they roller chopped them to try to kill those trees, they burned them, and then they blopped and scattered them. So you can envision some of these sites are greatly altered. So we embarked on trying to put some meaningful analysis to this programmatic approach. We used 61 AIM and LMF samples in the that occurred within the UFO. We used the USGS land treatment database to attribute them as treated and untreated. We did the same thing with 123 AIM and LMF points in treated sites outside of our field office in the same MLRA 34B and 36 that our field office occurs in. And we were very fortunate. My predecessor had a very robust treatment monitoring program that lasted about a decade during the initial National Fire Plan flush of treatments that occurred between 2000 and 2010. And this data included 390 controls, 253 mechanical treatment observations, 44 prescribed fire treatment observations, and another 120 wildfire observations. And what was really unique is that we have this monitoring data over a pretty decent monitoring intervals of roughly 1, 3, and 5 years. So we used all these data sets to focus on vegetation and soils, runoff and erosion using common core indicators derived from the AIM. For vegetation, we focused on plant functional group cover and invasive species cover. On soils and sediment transport, we focused on bare ground and total foliar cover.
All right, so one of the things that we looked at for a analysis question was how many tons of sediment are lost after treatment. So in this graph, we looked at both the existing data that Ken described that we had local to the field office, the 10 years of data, and we grouped that data by years. So we had 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years, 5 to 6, 7, and then where we brought the AIM data in was the greater than 18 years, because as Ken mentioned, when we looked at the land treatment database, we were able to attribute the AIM data to specific treatments and figure out how far out those treatments were. So basically, we were able to use the AIM data to confirm that we saw a stabilization of our percent bare ground at approximately year 7. So this was important to be able to document this with a longer term monitoring period than what we had even with our pretty extensive monitoring. Next slide. So then what we were able to do is take that data, we plugged it into the rangeland hydrology erosion model so that we could predict runoff and erosion rates from the sites that we had monitoring data. Next slide. So then again, just trying to answer our analysis question of how many tons of sediment were mobilized after mechanical treatment. We broke the analysis into mechanical treatments as well as prescribed fires. Just showing here the some of the indicators that the REM model requires. All data that we were able to compute using the existing data as well as the AIM data. And then the resulting output from the model is average soil loss, and we were able to break this into the same grouping of what would be expected 1 to 2 years post-treatment on through 7 years. And it did indicate that initially when you have less cover, you see a corresponding increase in your soil loss, but eventually it does, after 7 years, result in a lower tons per acre than the control points. Next slide. I think this one's back to you, Ken.
Okay, so one of the questions we had from a vegetation standpoint is, do UFO treatments look worse than other treatments in the region? We know from doing land health evaluations throughout the field office, we visit a lot of these treatments, that they don't look good. And so we wanted to know, are they any worse than other folks' treatment outcomes? So we used AIM data to look at total herbaceous native cover comparing our field office treatments to other treatments that occurred in similar MLRAs as our field office. And we could see from the figure on the top left there that we have significantly greater native herbaceous cover on treatments outside of the Uncompahgre field office than we do in. Conversely, we looked at perennial grass cover, and the figure on the top right shows that we do indeed see significantly greater perennial grass cover on treatments outside the Uncompahgre field office than within. So this was like a kind of a high five moment for us. We thought, sure, the AIM data is telling us a lot of things. It's meeting up with our hypothesis, and we're pretty happy. So there we go. So then we started looking at the woody species stuff and things that happen longer term. And we started seeing that the UFO treated areas have substantially better shrub cover and tree covers. Both those figures depict there compared to treatments in the MLRA. So we started questioning, but wait a minute, that doesn't seem to line up with our hypothesis or what we've seen on the ground. So it forced us to dig a little deeper, and what we realized is that the 23 treated sites that we have AIM data on were actually treatments that were 18 to 60 years old. So what we realize is that what we're seeing is succession and recovery of these older treatments. They're sort of doing what you'd expect as woodies increase, herbaceous, foliar cover starts to drop. And so we then moved on to our next question, which was, how do treated areas look compared to untreated areas? So we looked at using our local field office data, which reflects short-term treatment conditions of 1 to 7 years post-treatment. And we were seeing that indeed our untreated controls had substantially better native species cover than mechanical treatments, prescribed fire and wildfire. We saw that our control sites have substantially less invasive species than treatments, and that shrub cover was also substantially better in our controls than our treatment. So that led us to the next question. How long does it take for treatments to recover so that we can resume pre-treatment management? One of the big debates in our field office has long been that the standard 2-year removal of grazing following a treatment is not adequate, and maybe that was what was causing some of our failures. Conversely, we had a range program that was pretty adamant that without data, they were reluctant to consider longer. So we embarked on answering that question as well. So we looked at total native species cover over time, and we can see that as you'd expect, native species cover dropped substantially in year 1 to 2 following a treatment than our controls, and then it progressively increases and stabilizes at about 7 years out. Conversely, we use the AIM data to look at woody species because we know those take a little longer to recover. So the two figures on the right, shrub cover and tree cover both, You can see that, as expected, woodies decline years 1 through 7 after the treatment. But then interestingly, the data suggests that about 18 years or greater, we start to see comparable shrub cover as our controls, and more interestingly, comparable tree cover as our controls. So what we realize is that, particularly looking at native species cover and in particular herbaceous cover, the standard 2 years of no grazing is often not enough time for treatments to recover. We found that within 1 to 2 years, we had about 58% native species cover compared to controls, whereas in years 3 to 4, we had about 78% cover. 5 to 6 years out, we're seeing about 90% cover compared to the controls, and then greater than 7 years, 97% cover compared to the controls. So it would appear that there's a pretty good argument to be made that perhaps more than 2 years may be necessary. So the AIM data helped us understand the long-term recovery of woody species as well. That would have been missing from our local data. So the 18 to 60 years is roughly about the time frame we start to see woody species like sagebrush and PJ recover to pre-treatment cover values. Another question we wanted to look at is, do aspect and precipitation zone matter in the outcomes of treatments? So we embarked on a GIS exercise and attributed our data set with both aspect and precipitation zones. And looking at native species cover on the top figure there, lo and behold, aspect and elevation do seem to matter. In that 12 to 15 inch precip zone, we see generally higher cover values on north and east aspects, and generally lower cover values for native species on south and west aspects. As you move up in elevation and precipitation zone, things become less clear, but still there appears to be slightly better native species cover values on those east and north aspects than on south and west aspects. Conversely, looking at the figure below, non-native species, we see that in that 12 to 15 inch precip zone, that south aspects really support invasive species establishment compared to north and west aspects, and I still remain perplexed by that east figure, but nevertheless. Conversely, when you move up into that 16 to 20 inch precip zone, we still see that south and west aspects favor invasive species cover, but not nearly as bad as in that 12 to 15 inch precip zone. So aspect and precipitation zone do matter, and the resistance and resilience concepts talked about in the Great Basin appear to be alive and well on the eastern end of the Colorado Plateau as well. So concluding thoughts for this NEPA process. The expectation from this programmatic environmental assessment was the ability to use a determination of NEPA adequacy of DNA for site-specific projects. This can be challenging if the programmatic analysis lacks data. We had a unique situation with 15 years of post-treatment data coupled with AIM data to support the vegetation and soils analysis. But I do want to point out that we embarked on this EA thinking we would use the AIM data to solely rely on for our analysis, but we quickly realized that our local data set could fit into that and inform it as well, and I think we ended up with a good product as a result. As you can imagine, we received a fair bit of pushback on the data analysis, due in part to the lack of other data and resources like grazing, wildlife, and fuels. There was a lot of reluctance to modify the design features or consider mitigation based on our data analysis. So much so that our field manager decided to send this document out as an unsigned draft and receive public input on it. So it was released to the public, and we received substantial comments regarding the purpose and need for the proposed action. So after the review of the comments, the ID team decided to cancel the EA and consider a new proposed action to focus on restorative measures for existing treatments. Any new treatments we're thinking going forward are going to require site-specific analysis and a separate environmental assessment. The decision-making process was challenging, but the ability to analyze this long-term data sets and statistically prove treatment conditions ultimately drove our NEPA process. Alex, I think that's all Jedd and I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ken and Jedd. That was great. I really enjoyed your presentation. And it looks like we do have a couple questions lined up for you. The first one we have here is from JT. So his question is, with data in hand, is UFO now waiting more than 2 years post-treatment before resuming the pre-treatment management practices? And if so, how long are you waiting?
Well, I think we've conclusively shown that we indeed need to wait more than 2 years. Ultimately, what we think the direction we're heading in is at the development of a treatment project, establishing monitoring thresholds that once they're met will make the decision for us as far as when to resume that pre-treatment management.
Thanks, Ken. Great question. Thank you, JT. We have another question from Anonymous that says, do you have treatment sites that grazing occurred after 2 seasons of rest to compare to the numbers for herbaceous recovery for years 3 to 7?
Well, that question came up from our range program as well. It proved to be incredibly difficult because we don't have great records. So we fell back to our next best position, which was we looked at the documents that these treatments occurred under over that 10-year period, and lo and behold, we found that the standard design feature was a minimum of 2 years rest. So our analysis conclusion was that we assumed that grazing was returned to these treatment areas either the season after the 2 years of rest or shortly thereafter.
Great, thank you. I think we just have one more question here from Scott. Scott says, very cool work, guys. Thanks for sharing. Your management questions related to treatments, land health assessment, and fire all share a common theme of assessing upland erosion rates. Are you exploring linkages between upland erosion, or condition in general, and in-stream conditions, such as fine sediment? Having terrestrial and low-tick AIM data is setting us up to be able to look at these linkages and land health in general in a more comprehensive manner. Great question. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I would say that that's ultimately what our goal would be moving forward, is to continue to monitor the both upland sites as well as the aquatic sites and be able to look at trend over the long term of the fire. So we'll be using targeted sites or targeted monitoring sites to continue to track that trend over time, to be able to better make that connection between the upland and the aquatic.
Thank you, Jedd. That's great. Awesome. So we don't have any other questions lined up, so we can go ahead and wrap up the event. Thanks a ton to Ken and Jedd for being our guinea pigs. This is the first run of this via Teams live event, so thank you so much. Really enjoyed your presentation. And just as a reminder, we will be posting this recording of this presentation on our AIM SharePoint. So If you want to download that and share it or review, it'll be available probably this afternoon on the AIM SharePoint. That's all I have.
Remember to go there to look for the next presentation that you're interested. As you know, this will be a recurrent series. And next week, we will have Mike Rock presenting an introduction to the Data AIM portal.
Great.
Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you all.
Farewell.